All right, Craig Wagner, Peter Christensen, going through page 3 of the new REPC. Well, it's a continuation of section 8, dealing with, in this case, real estate brokerage compensation, which you do address on page 1, the amounts, but this then gives further kind of clarification of, just some making clear that, any amount entered there can't be more than the written buyer broker agreement that you have in place, which already exists in the previous REPC. It is part of, some considerations nationally, but it's meant to be transparent for you and your buyer. Now, there have been some questions. Well, what if, erroneously or it did exceed the buyer broker agreement? Well, any excess amount is then returned to the seller. You'll notice it doesn't necessarily give the seller a right to cancel. It just, the transaction continues, but the excess amount would go to the seller. I don't anticipate that being utilized much, if at all, but it is meant in those weird situations. We didn't want to penalize the buyer for that. Section C, seller's contribution to closing costs. Now, Peter, you do ask for in page 1 for closing costs. Seller agrees. Really, what can the buyer use these closing costs for?
Yeah, this is a good. So you'll notice a theme. Some of the changes there, we've pointed out already a couple of really substantive changes, but a lot of the changes are kind of explaining what we think the practice is already and trying to take an argument out of it, clarifying a little more to eliminate arguments over strict definitions. And so This is one of those cases where what is a closing cost? Well, ask 10 different people, you get 11 different answers. And so that's kind of an old man joke, isn't it?
Yeah,
I got that from an old man.
Because one of them might give 2, right?
That's right.
Perfect.
That's how you get it.
I like it.
You're sharp. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Well, when we list out like examples of what is a closing cost, and then somebody has something pop up that doesn't fit exactly but kind of fits, sometimes the buyer will see it one way and the seller will see it another. And so it really just says, hey, here are some examples of some things, but then at the end it says any unused portion of seller's contribution may, at buyer's option, be applied to any costs or expenses permitted by buyer's lender, if applicable. And then it does give another, including a reduction in the purchase price, and then it survives closing. So really just opening it up, saying, seller, just count on whatever you've pledged there being used by the buyer. If it doesn't fit one of the list items, finance costs, closing costs, prepaid escrow, some of the stuff that's listed out in the beginning, they still have the discretion to use it in another way if it relates to a cost to the transaction and it's permitted by the buyer's lender, which is really underwriter, right? It doesn't run afoul of any of the underwriter guidelines.
Exactly. Perfect. 8.3, skipping down to E, rental deposits, prepaid rents. Just one word was added where it talks about any of these agreements, short-term rental bookings, long-term leases, shall be paid, transferred, that's the new word, or credited by seller to buyer at settlement. The main emphasis is just to kind of build on that existing language that, look, now the new owner is entitled to those accounts with regards to any of those benefits that come from the rentals of the property after closing.
Right.
Skipping down to 8.3 H, this is an entirely new subsection. Seller's personal service agreements. So this section really deals with just exactly the title heading. Any personal services agreements that are obviously personal to the seller, buyer's not obligated to assume those. And then it gives kind of a list, not an including, but it's not an exhaustive list, but gives some examples like property management agreements, short-term rental management agreements, security system agreements, pest control, just these things that are personal to the seller that maybe they had thought that the buyer would naturally assume. Well, don't assume that. It's something that they would need to negotiate
Thought
if the
or
buyer.
hoped.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. So really, as an agent, you're going to need to have that dialogue with the seller before going under contract to know what to counter or to look at those terms of those agreements respectively and know what maybe the buyouts are or the penalties for early cancellations and how that is going to be handled.
Or even the process of changing over to a new owner if that's the route they're going. But I really like this. Again, this is more putting into writing what the practice really was, and under the law, probably how it would pan out anyway. But just keep in mind that you've got to sit down with your seller and address any of these ongoing contracts. If it's a long-term pest control contract or lawn care contract or solar or water softener, whatever the case may be, a security system, stuff where you've engaged in a long-term contract, it's not assumed that the buyer will pick up the terms of that contract and be obligated to it. So you got to factor that in. If there are costs that come with it, you got to know. We're trying to really trying to help people think in a net way with this contract, even how that cover sheet is formatted is what are you going to get and what are you going to pay? And so this is going along with that theme of like, hey, you got to deal with this. If it's going to cost you money to buy out that solar contract, if they're going to have to remove equipment, you're going to need to know about all this. You're going to need to do the repairs. You're going to need to convince the buyer to take on the contract if that's an easier way to handle it. Or you're going to end up paying for a service that the buyer's going to get if they want. And seller, you may be on the hook for it and, use that as a selling point. I don't know.
Yeah.
But have a conversation and see what needs to be done before the home is sold.
Excellent. Section 9, settlement and closing. Obviously, this is newly located. It's no longer in Section 3 of the REPC. So settlement, 9.1, the definition has not changed. It's the same. 9.2, closing, the definition of closing has not changed. It is the same. 9.3, possession, it's gotten more robust. There's a lot of newly added language.
The date's not there.
Date's on now is on page 1. 9.3, the new language that's added is meant to be preemptive. We really hope that this clause or this language never gets utilized. That would be our hope. We would hope that any sort of rental of the property after closing is negotiated, both buyer and seller are on the same page, and that the contract reflects the understanding of the two parties. But there are instances, potentially, where a seller decides on their own, maybe their own replacement property isn't finished, maybe it's new construction, or they just want to blow through the dates, and there's really not clarity as to what happens. Now there's language in here that maybe apprises both the buyer and seller. Well, there is a potential penalty that the buyer could pursue should the seller detain the property after closing without having that rental agreement in place. So the default, there's language here, and you can fill in a dollar amount that's higher than this, but the default is it's going to be $300 per day, and that's going to be part of the calculus for the treble damages. So really, you triple that, so it's going to be closer to $900 per day, at least that initial fee. And it's not meant to be, hey, here's rent. Like, I can go ahead and just continue to rent the property. I just have to pay you this dollar amount. No, this is meant to help the buyer should they now incur damages to potentially go to court should they have to, which we don't want that. Like, this isn't something that anyone wants, but it may cause a seller pause if they do decide, oh, maybe I should just move out because that's what I've agreed to in the contract. Because this provision would now give them some additional consideration.
Yeah, just clarifies there was no penalty, and this is not a huge problem that I've heard of, and so hopefully it will continue to not be. But it does give what was a little ambiguous of what penalties can I seek through the court right now under the old REPC, there aren't many. I mean, you can, but the court loves to look because they're going to treat the holdover seller as a tenant in the eyes of the law. And so they're looking for some sort of rent to calculate damages, and there isn't any. They weren't supposed to be there. There was no rent contemplated. And so this gives the court a penalty to start with. Here you go. Here's the amount. And the funny thing is you could put 0 in there to make your offer look good, and it's still going to be $300.
It's still going to be $300. Yeah, for sure.
So that's kind of funny.
Yeah. Okay, Section 10, title insurance. Obviously, this has been relocated. So you're going to have to relearn like where the respective sections are. And I know that's going to be
take a minute.
Take a minute because I'm like, oh, this is Section 6. No,
Yeah.
it's now in Section 10. But the language in 10.1 really is the same.
Yeah.
So that's the end of page 3 of the new REPC.
See, they're getting easier by the video.